Anyway, I'm Paul Jolly, interviewing David Arnold for the Accidental Archivist Project, which is funded by the National Lottery Heritage Fund. Also present, Spike Knowles and Muddy Farrell.
It's the 29th of April.
Yeah.
I feel like I should.
We've got this.
Say, I need a lawyer. We've got 24 hours in police custody.
Yeah, we are in Luton.
Yeah.
Don't forget. Yeah. So, David, were you born in Luton?
I was, yeah.
Yeah.
I was born in Waller Avenue in Leagrave.
Right. Dare we ask you what age that is? How long ago?
When I was born, I was naught.
Brilliant. So we'll move
But
on
it was
from
in
that.
1962 when
62.
I was born. Yeah.
And you obviously went to school in Luton and did
Yeah.
all that business.
I was at Beechwood Primary School, Beechwood Road, and then Chorney Boys School, and then Luton VI Form, and then a year at Barnfield. So.
What did you do at Barnfield? Was it technical?
I
college?
was doing a foundation year in art. So it was at the time when I think the idea of doing something in the arts was quite alien, certainly to our family. It was something that other people did. And it was difficult to find somewhere or something to be. And my mum and dad were primarily concerned with what are you going to do. And the idea of doing music or the arts was like, there isn't a job, you know, yes. It's like you don't apply for a job. So I thought I would spend a year doing foundation art with maybe to be an artist. And I go, well, what does that mean? Yeah. I didn't know, but I knew I wanted to do something creative, and that seemed a way of eking it out for another year, which is what I did.
Was that visual arts there?
Yes, it was proper art.
Yeah.
Painting, sculpture,
all that stuff.
All that stuff. They did do a class for graphic design, but the proper, what they used to call them graphos. There was a certain amount of not good feeling between the two. You know, I think that the people who were the fine artists looked down on graphic art. But you know, that's when you're young and foolish.
Well, you probably got involved with music at Chorney, did you? More than
yes, I was in the school band, which again, you know, looking back on those things, the value of a good teacher was paramount, and I was really fortunate that even from primary school, that the music teachers seemed so unbelievably enthusiastic about the subject. And it was, the thing is, I mean, music's a joyous thing anyway, and you don't get much of that in school. And when you play music, you know, and you're a part of the thing that makes the noise, that makes you feel happy, that's great. You know, It's like, I'm not a sporty person, but I would imagine that if you were really good at football and you were in the school team and the school team won something, that would feel pretty good. Yeah. And for me, being in the school choir or the school band and playing a piece of music that elevated everything, you know, you just felt for a moment that you were floating. That felt really good. So,
and at that time, that was before there was Luton Music Service, I think, wasn't it? The schools had their own.
Yes, they were independent.
Individual.
I mean, at Chorney we had peripatetic teachers for instruments, so I learnt clarinet at school, and they did have instruments that kids could practice with and take home.
Yeah.
I'm not sure what's happened to that anymore, but yeah, it was a great bonus for people who, you know, couldn't afford to learn, and the peripatetic teachers were free to us as students. So learning formally with instruments that you couldn't otherwise afford was incredibly important. But I'd say the most important thing was the enthusiasm of the teachers. You know, the verve at which they came to music. And I remember on my first year at Chorney, desperately wanted to be a part of the music thing, and so they had a choir audition. In fact, everyone had to do it. And all the schools, the kids on the first year would line up, and Colin Smith was the teacher, and he would go around and he would just listen as he walked past, and if he liked your voice, he'd just tap you on the shoulder and you were in. So I was really trying hard, and I got in. Because I remember seeing him standing up in front of all these kids, talking about music with such enthusiasm and such vigour, that I thought there must be something in this, because he's a grown-up.
Yeah.
He's a grown-up and he seems to love this thing, you know. I mean, I've always loved it, but, you know, actually to see a teacher that enthusiastic about something that I loved as well, And he seemed to want it all to be brilliant, and his whole thing was, let's be really good at this.
Yeah.
And it's only later, you know, when you think about the importance of playing in an ensemble, you know, learning in an ensemble, about how important that is societally, because you're sitting in a group of musicians who are kids, and you learn to take instruction without arguing. You know, you learn to balance your performance so it sits in with the rest of your section. You hear what other people are doing, what the brass players are doing, what the percussion's doing, and you react and respond to that, but always with the overall sense of improving it and making it sound better as a whole. And socially, you think, like, there's incredibly important tools to have.
Yeah.
You know,
And
to be able to listen to other people, to know the best place for you to be, when to stand up and be noticed, when to let someone else have a moment, when to be a part of a team that makes the whole thing better, and how to take instruction from someone whose only criteria is to make it better for everyone.
Yeah. So that's kind of an inspirational teacher situation.
Yeah, incredibly important,
Yeah.
which is why the lack of them is so
Yeah, I was going
distressing.
to mention how difficult it is now for people to have that,
Yeah.
through lots of different reasons at school,
Yeah.
to have access, and
Yeah,
for teachers to have that time to develop
Yeah.
relationships with
Yeah.
the group. Or,
because it's not just a subject.
yeah, no, it's incredible. So those social skills, there are basic social skills, aren't they?
Yeah,
in a sense?
incredibly important.
Yeah.
If you think everyone, you know, if everyone understood that,
Yeah, it all came from that.
everything would be a lot nicer, I'd say.
For sure. Well, there's things we can say about that in terms of contemporary society out there.
Yes, yeah,
So-
hugely important. And I think the lack of music teaching and the lack of music facility is part of the problem.
Yeah, yeah, different groups, you say. So, after sixth form, did you work locally, or did you get involved in musically professionally at that time at all?
Well, I've been playing locally in sort of pubs and social clubs since a very early age, because my dad used to sing in sometimes at Caesar's Palace, you know, the nightclub, sometimes in pubs and social clubs. He worked at Skefco in Sundon Park, so they had a social club there. Electrolux had a social club, Vauxhall had a social club, and Sportsfields, in the days when, you know, that was normal. They had a big sports club, and Saturday night they would have a live band, or sometimes it was just, you know, 2 or 3 people. My dad used to sing, and he used to take us along to those places and make, you know, as soon as I learned to play something on the recorder at primary school, you know, he'd tell everyone to shut up, and you'd stand up and you'd play London's Burning and get a round of applause and then go off, you know.
So you got used to playing in front of an audience?
I got used to being in front of people, and also it was a lot of those places people would get up and sing as well. So, you know, you'd be accompanying people, and so that was. I mean, we were doing sort of paid gigs from the age of about 11 or 12. You know,
Fantastic.
Around Bedfordshire, just like a 3-piece. Me and my brother on drums, and Tony O'Rourke, who was the guy I was at primary school with, played bass. So we just used to go and do gigs, and it was as simple as that. So
that would be harder to do now, wouldn't it? Although those clubs have disappeared quite a lot.
Everything's disappeared.
But, you know, the whole health and safety situation.
Oh, I mean, you can't imagine. I mean, I would imagine the disappointment I would feel of going into a social club and seeing there's a bunch of 14-year-olds playing.
Yeah.
You know, I mean, hopefully it was good enough for it not to be a problem, but I mean, it's unlikely that you would see that now, because no one's allowed to do anything like that. But it was an education in understanding people, because sometimes you play in places that were a bit rough, and you'd see some things that weren't that nice, and having to deal with, you know, drunk and disorderly people, trying to have a conversation with someone while you're singing a song at the same time, you know, all that kind of stuff. It was an education in what people were like, you know.
For sure, and also learning the worth of being a musician.
Yeah, you know, it's understanding everything about your environment, you know, whether that's good or bad, and being able to play. But it was all covers, you know. I mean, I was sort of writing songs, but not in anger, you know. Didn't really know what that would be or what that would entail, or even where you would get to play them. But we, you know, started writing a little bit, I think, when I was about 13 or 14.
And did you see that as like a career path, or did you see that separate to your, growing up?
I saw it as I mean, I desperately wanted to be in the arts, and I didn't mind what it was. I remember thinking like I'd happily be like an actor or a musician or a filmmaker or an artist. That's what I felt like doing.
Yeah.
But of course, these things are out of your reach, and there is no pathway to it. Certainly in those days, there wasn't as much, especially in Luton. There really wasn't anywhere where it's like, this is where you go to do this. And my dad worked in a factory. My mum was a housewife, so they had no idea about how things worked. And it was like, obviously, when all you get is headlines, it's like it's sort of terrifying that you think that your kids would go into that world. And how do you even do it? How do you get into it? It's like no one knew. So the whole thing was an enormous mystery. And when you have an aspiration to be a part of that world, but you have no access to it.
Yeah, because at that time, the access that people had to the academies, the Royal Academy, all those kinds of things. It was very difficult.
Yeah, I did get an audition at was it the Royal Academy or Guildhall or Trinity? I can't remember. But anyway, obviously I didn't get in. I wasn't good enough as a clarinet player.
Right.
So that, in a way, kind of series of official disappointments in a way. Like trying to get to things formally and not really being good enough to do it. But I realised from being in the school band, that my ability as a performer was limited, because I was sitting next to people who, even though the same age as me, were infinitely better. And so I figured, well, all I've got is the things that I'm hearing in my head and my ability to translate that. And so I suppose, I started thinking more about writing. I still love playing and playing live and being a part of the thing again that made the noise, because that's what got me interested in it in the first place. And I still do like playing live. I just don't do very much of it.
So did you play guitar at that time as well? Or did that come a bit
not
later?
very well. I'd say not very well at everything. I didn't have a piano at home. I think I got an electric piano when I was about 14 or 15, which was very crude in those days. It was a Krumar, like not touch sensitive, just one single sound that was quite ugly. And everything crackled, and it was horrible, as everything did. It's like my guitar amp was, my dad made it out of an old TV set, and it's probably lethal. He was making guitar cables out of old wires that he found lying around it. Yeah.
And with those instruments, the piano, the guitar, because presumably you had lessons with the clarinet.
Yeah, formally with clarinet at Chorney. With the guitar, it was an odd way into that, because my dad got sent out by my mum to buy himself a suit for an occasion, because he didn't have a decent suit, and instead of that he came back with a guitar.
Fantastic.
I mean, he couldn't play the guitar, but he would sing a lot, and he had lots and lots of sheet music, like the Great American Songbook, basically in a suitcase. And he just left it. He left this guitar in the house, and I remember watching it, seeing Top of the Pops, and looking at this guitar and thinking, like, it feels like a bit of like a magic wand. Do you know what I mean? There's something mystical about that those people are making that noise with that thing. So I started picking it up, and I would teach myself. In those days, if you bought a sheet music, they would have the chord symbols.
In the little boxes.
So you know where to put your fingers. So I kind of taught myself that initially to be able to play songs. I used to go down to the Luton Music Centre and what was then Marshall's in Berry Park, where you buy sheet music of songs that you liked, and I basically learned guitar from that, and listened to a lot of records, listened to the radio all the time, so always listening to music.
Because there was all that Bert Weedon stuff at the time.
Yeah, playing a day was a big thing for a lot of people. I had that, but I never looked at it. I was learning from, the sheet music that my dad had was it was pre-guitar accompaniment, so it was ukulele shapes,
right?
Ukulele or banjo shapes, it wasn't, but it had the names of the chords anyway. So I'd buy a book of chords and then draw that in on the top, and just played a lot. Just wanted. And guitar was the thing The guitar was a thing that felt like it was an extension of me, like I could play that
Yeah.
and not really think about it too much. Clarinet was I couldn't improvise on a clarinet, you know.
Right.
If you put the part in front of me, I could play it,
Yeah.
but I didn't feel like a free player of the
plus
clarinet.
it's changed a bit now, but in those days, like, that was an ensemble instrument, was it? The clarinet, you played with other people. You
Yes.
played with that.
Yeah,
You know,
yeah,
it's-
and guitar was very social,
Yeah.
you know. And if you're songwriting, clarinet's not much use.
Yeah.
It's not much use when you're playing it anyway.
No. Not for other people, yeah.
I've only written once for the clarinet in 30 years, and I think it was where I wanted something that was unpleasant.
Right.
I just never got on with it.
So I mean, aside to all this, you haven't ever gone back to the clarinet in terms of...
No.
Still, no.
No, I mean I've picked it up and played it, you know, on a couple of silly, you know, stuff, the things that are just for the fun of it. But no, it's just I remember everything about
Yeah.
it, you know. I remember how to play it, but it's just the sound of it. I just could never get it to make it sound good.
Right.
Like the great jazz, you know, like the great jazz. I mean, you know, listen to Benny Goodman forever on it. You
Yeah,
know,
for sure.
But I could never, you know, I'm still in Voi che sapete, do you know what I mean? Like grade 5, 6
Yeah.
Mozart stuff, basically lots of scales. And I like
Yeah.
a good tune.
Good tune.
Yeah.
And clarinet started to get any kind of tonality out of it that's individual. It's
Yeah.
really, you know.
Yeah, it's difficult because it's fixed in so many ways, you know. But anyway, so that's my history with the clarinet and my abandonment of it. So then we finished it. So we finished basically at Barnfield, and then I thought, well, can I do like music and art at the same time? I thought maybe I'd do a teaching degree. So I went to Middlesex Poly for about 6 months to do a teaching degree because I thought I could do music and art at the same time. But then the 6 months I was there, we were just learning about teaching. You weren't learning about the subject. So I packed that in and then basically began a kind of 8-9 year run of working in various odd places, doing weird things whilst trying to do something in music.
Yeah.
Really, which is where kind of 33 happened.
Yeah. So, how did you come into 33? Because we've talked to a lot of people, and some people say, "Oh, it's purely by accident." Other people said, "I know I made a beeline for it," you know, because.
Well, we were
word of
looking
mouth.
for rehearsals. I was in a band, early 20s, and Spike was the singer, and I think he'd been involved in
Yeah.
some stuff at 33 in the drama area, the films and everything. And he said there was rehearsal space down there, so we used to come and rehearse at 33 on it was the top floor. It was the second floor, and I loved the. I thought, why didn't I know this place existed before? Because it seemed like it'd be full of people who were equally like dazed as I was. You know, it's like no one really knew how, but they knew why.
Yeah.
You know, and that was like, it's quite a relief to find other people who were trying to create stuff. Because Luton, as you know, wasn't like a hotbed of artistic, you know, creative activity. And even though they had the library, you know, the library theatre, everything was formal. So when you talked about the arts in Luton at that point, it was you either, you know, go to Trinity or, you know, learn a formal instrument, or you can have acting lessons in kids drama lessons at the Luton Library Theatre or at various places, which were, you know, fantastic.
Yeah. Betty Rudd ones, were they?
Yeah, Betty
Yeah.
Rudd.
Youth Workshop.
Yeah, and they were great, but it was formal.
Yeah.
And 33 felt informal. 33 felt like everyone is basically doing what they wanted, which is how great work is made anyway. And eventually you recognise the bit that's good. So we were rehearsing in one room, and sometimes I just go down there and play the piano. Again, didn't have a piano at home. And that's when we started meeting other people on the stairways and in the cafe who were interested in other aspects of the arts. You know, some wanted to be actors, some wanted to be film directors, some wanted to be writers, some were poets, some were recording engineers, some were just musicians. So there's a big group of people who are all equally, I think, looking for the same thing, coming from very different angles, but found a kind of centre.
Yeah.
You know, a place that this is where we go to do these things.
Yeah, a lot of people said to us that kind of social aspect of where people just bump into each other and
Yeah.
was like, you know, part of the creative spark for the place.
Yeah, yeah. Well, it just, you know, it was a place that was, you know, we thought was run by grown-ups.
Yeah.
Who should know better, right?
Oh, we still here.
Yeah, right. Grown-ups who should know better, and yet somehow there's these grown-ups there. Like my music teacher, who seemed so enthusiastic about music, it made me want to do it.
Yeah.
You got these people who were running, say these people, you know, you, were running this place, and I go like, well, it must be okay because there's grown-ups doing stuff here and saying it's all right to do it.
Yes.
And everyone went there because it's like we all kind of feel the same thing. You know, where can we go to be legitimately considered as a creative person? And there wasn't really anywhere else in Luton that wasn't formal that did that. And I think that was the appeal of it.
Yeah.
Was that it felt like you had a home in a way.
Yeah, there was no kind of exam requirements to
No.
walk into the place.
No.
Yeah.
And I remember like the revolution in video editing, where, you know, the fire that was lit when 33 had their first video shown on Channel 4.
Mm-hmm.
One of those ones that were on midnight, you know, like New Young Creators programs or something, and it was something with a stuttering Margaret Thatcher, you know, sort of video DJing stuff, you know, and it's like, and everyone was going, we've actually got something on the telly, you know, and it was like, that doesn't happen, and then there it went happening, you know, it was amazing.
And then sort of through all those kinds of involvements, you met other people that you started to work creatively with, didn't you?
Yeah. The most significant one was Danny Cannon, he was making part of Spike's group with actors. Danny was I think from Stopsley High School, and his dad was already in film as a props man, and Danny loved cinema, you know, American cinema, and loved things like Ridley Scott and, you know, Alan Parker, and films that looked like films, you know, like American films certainly, and so he was keen on making these things, and he was doing that to the best of his ability with down there, and we used to bump into each other, and I always said like I wanted to do films, and he said I want to do films, and he said, well, why don't you do mine? And so we started. I had no equipment, you know, but we started making films together, and it seemed like every few weeks, you know, Danny would corral a load of his friends, actors, out into different parts of the town to make these films, and then I would look at it and try and remember what happened, and I would record bits of music bit by bit in other people's houses, you know, particularly in John Rand, who at that point was the organist at the St Joseph's Church in Luton, who I'd heard owned a reel-to-reel tape machine. He had a 16-track reel-to-reel tape machine, and a couple of synthesizers, which never heard, you know, and drum machines and stuff. Like, oh my God, this is stuff you read about in magazines. But on a Tuesday, he used to let me go around his house and record these ideas that I had, one track at a time, while he was having his dinner. And I used to then mix it down onto cassette, and so in an hour I'd have to do the whole thing, track by track, and then bring it in, and we'd drop it into, you know, Danny would drop it into his little films, and then, you know, I think principally driven by Danny's idea to want to be, in a way, you know, he didn't think that commercial film was a dirty word, you know, he liked broad appeal stuff, I think. Was that he would then organise like premieres of these things, and people used to come to 33 and we'd show the film. And he'd make tickets, and he'd make crew t-shirts and logos, and we used to go to Luton to the market to buy, you know, choosing what letraset we were going to use for the logo for this film, and buying smoke pellets from the joke shop in order to, you know, set them off in people's front, you know, rooms, so he could shoot a scene in there and make it look like Tony Scott had lit it. So it's kind of, you know, creative, and, you know, I was involved in just around when they were shooting it, and, you know, occasionally did bits of say acting. I'm not seriously saying acting, but I was in it, doing things, and then we do the music, and the result of that was several years of doing that. And then Danny, of course, entered one of these things into the BBC Young Filmmaker of the Year competition, which I think was in 1986, and it won the overall competition. And Alan Parker was one of the judges, film director, and he recommended that Danny go to the National Film and Television School as a director, and he applied and got in. I applied and didn't get in, but I carried on doing Danny's films at the film school. And then several years later, after Danny had graduated, he gets his first feature film off the ground, convinces the producers to let me do it. I did it, and that was the start of everything else.
Was that the Young Americans or something?
It's the Young Americans, yeah.
That's interesting, the creative process when working with Danny. So you kind of answered it a bit by saying you did some acting with it. I mean, did you have a preconception about what the music would be?
I didn't, no. It was funny because I would only ever really think of it once I could see it. It's like I was watching scenes happen being filmed, but I don't quite know why I chose. I mean, we tried being in bands and everything. It wasn't really happening. I think everyone has dreams of doing that when you're younger, but it wasn't really happening. I think you sort of be a bit more realistic about things. But I realised that when I saw something, I would think of music. If I saw something, I would see it. I would hear it. And the worst thing you could say to me is like, "Here's a blank piece of paper. Do what you want." Because it's like, if I knew that, I'd be writing every day.
Yeah.
But if someone says, "Here's a 10-second sequence. Can you write something based on that?" and it was like, I'd hear it immediately.
Yeah.
So I was, just drawn towards visual. And maybe part of that was the thing with liking art as well. It's like you look at painting, somehow you feel differently about it. And if I look at a painting, I'll hear music about it. If I'm looking at a scene or a film, I'll hear music. And it's just being in touch with, recognising the music that you're hearing and being able to get that out of your head and into the world is the craft part, I suppose. And I informally learnt that by making all these little films, either at 33 or at the National Film and Television School, by doing it. So I'd never been taught composition formally, and extending the informality of 33, I suppose, into everything else that I'd done, was I kind of did it by doing it.
Yeah.
And learning how I could do it.
Yeah, and learning on the job's been a theme that crops up all the while.
Yeah, yeah.
With people working creatively.
Yeah.
At that stage of their lives,
And it might have been for me if I'd have started formally earlier, maybe doing a film music course, and there are lots of them about writing for film. I may have got into it earlier, but I mean, I had zero complaints. I think I was 31 by the time I got my first paid job as a composer.
Yeah. Will you pay for Danny's Young Americans?
There was a budget for that, but it still is true, sadly, that a lot of the time, that budget will be spent on getting a bunch of live players into a big room and making it sound like proper music. And I'm still doing that. And certainly in those days, I had no idea whether this would lead to anything. So we did have a budget, and we had enough for, I think, 1.5 sessions with I think it was about 55 piece orchestras.
Wow.
It was conceived orchestrally. It was quite a big deal in terms of how I felt about how I wanted the music to be, and Danny wanted it to be, sort of cinematic as well. We weren't looking at. It was at a time when there was a lot of new English directors were coming out, Paul Anderson and Danny, and there was a lot of kind of electronic music sequencers, and computers had started to be a big part of the composition process. So the expectation was you would do a kind of electronic based score, but I wanted it to be more like Ennio Morricone and John Barry than Kraftwerk, and so I went down that route and spent it all on an orchestra.
And did you write? I mean, I've had this conversation with other people like John Altman, who writes music and stuff. But so did you score out things individually, or did you use?
When I was, before computers, I was doing it by
Yes.
hand. I mean, certainly all the stuff we did at the National Film School, all the things that we did there, where there was some money for some real players, and then I would write it on, score paper and then write the parts out, and it was quite, never enjoyed that part of it because it took so long.
Yeah, because that was before, Sebelius was just coming.
Yes, yeah, that hadn't happened, so everything was handwritten. Most of the things I did, certainly then doing the Hollywood stuff, for the first 4 years of that till about 1998, everything was handwritten. You would go to Paramount Studios and they would have a music department where they'd have 30 copyists in a room, and that guy would be doing all the flutes, that guy would be doing all the clarinets, that guy did the oboes.
And were they doing all the
and it
transcribing?
Was all transcribing from the original handwritten score, which they'd been photocopied, and then they would produce the parts, and whenever you changed it, the copyists used to come and they would have these pieces of white sticky tape that had staves, blank staves on it. You would
paste it over
it, write the new bits out. So and it was beautiful. Like handwriting was beautiful. That all died within about 4 years or 5 years. It just all went, and everything is like Sebelius and all the other systems you can get now. So everything certainly changed in a remarkably short period of time. But I'm trying to remember what we were talking about. Oh yeah, so I do it by pencil and paper, and then when I got my first Atari, which was a couple of years before we did Young Americans, so it was about 1991, I suppose. I got called Steinberg Pro 24, and it had a score edit page, and I would lock this thing to the picture. I say lock it, I didn't lock it because I didn't know what it was. I was again learning on the job. When someone did something in the picture which I was playing on a VHS machine, I would just press go on the sequencer and then sort of play it and then go back and edit the part. So I would kind of arrange the score as I went through, and then in score edit, Nicholas Dodd, who was like a formal orchestrating conductor, because I tried conducting it. It's, that's a proper job. You need to know what you're doing. And I realised I wasn't any good at that. So Nick would come around and we'd go through the score edit pages, and he would take those away and then fully orchestrate the final thing from Young Americans onwards. But up to that point, because there'd never been any money for anything, I did it myself. Yeah.
So was Young Americans like a calling card for you in a sense?
It became one historically. I mean, in the rearview mirror, it definitely was. I mean,
you didn't think about that at the time.
I'd never had a commercial. I'd never had a commercial thing. It was the first thing that I'd ever done, and the song with Björk was the first thing I'd ever done that had got released. I mean, I'd worked on records and things, but very much as a sort of programmer, or as a guitar player, or a sort of semi production sort of things. So I'd been around studios for a couple of years, so I knew my way around that, and that always helps, when you're doing stuff on your own, to understand how everything works. But I had a great epiphany, I think, in 1990 when I was working on a record as a programmer. So this was when I had sort of a couple of racks of synths and things and samplers. A guy he booked Peter Gabriel's studio, Real World, for a couple of weeks for recording, and he said, "I'm not working on Sunday. If you want to use the studio, you can, because it's all paid for." And I thought, wow, I'm in this place. It's like a 96 channel SSL, and there's an amazing drum room and all these mics and everything was like, this is stuff you dream about. I went there on a Sunday morning and I realised I didn't have a song. And from that point on, technology lost all its appeal for me, and I realised that it's material first, always material. The music is the thing that comes first. Slightly change it, your idea about it a little bit, because you can use technology to create things that sound musical, not necessarily music, and I think they're valid as well. But I'm still a bit old-fashioned. It's like I tend to want to have a tune. I want to have something which I could play to you and say, this is the music for that. It's not always like that, but that's my preference. So at that point, I figured gear's important, but it's really not that important. It's important that you have the material. It's like if you're a playwright and you can do it with a shitty old pencil, and a pad.
Yeah.
You know, you don't have to have a £2,000, you know, lovely, beautiful pen, and the right, you know, 180 GSM paper, whatever it is, and whatever density paper it is. It will look nice, but it's the quality is in the work, right? So that was a big moment for me. You know, realised that gear is fine, but you can get lost in it, and you can let it lead you, and also you can use it as an excuse for not doing anything.
So did you create something on that day?
No, I didn't.
You didn't? You
No,
just had
I
the
went for a
machine.
long walk.
Yeah.
And rethought, and when I came back, it was like I was a different person, I think,
Wow.
to a certain extent, because, you know, I've been working in a lot of places where people would come in to buy equipment, and they'd always talk to me about how they couldn't do something because they didn't have a certain mic or they didn't have a certain reverb unit.
You're all plugging it.
And I was doing these little films with Danny where it's like, well, I've worked with what I've got. And a lot of the time that was nothing, or you'd be busking it, you know, with bits and pieces that you could borrow here and there. And the idea that you would not do something because, you know, it's like, oh, I can't work because I haven't got my favourite pencil. You know, it's like, I like a 4B, I've only got a 3B, so I can't possibly do it. You know, well, you could, and then you could just work around that, you know. So I think, you know, I learnt a lot from that as well. You know, I like my favourite phrase is, well, one of my favourite phrases is like inspiration is for amateurs.
Yeah. That must give you some thoughts now about AI and how all that is.
That's pretty dangerous. But I'm sort of in agreement with Simon Pegg. He talked about it, and he said, like, a computer is never going to have its heart broken. You know, so all it can ever do is to give you an assimilation of someone else's feeling, which I think as humans we can see through. You know, I think, especially with music, I think you can spot fakery a mile off. But I think it's going to do a lot of damage at a certain level. And if we're talking about, this is off topic a little bit, but I mean, if you're talking about things like daytime TV, you know, there are people whose job it is to write music for Cash in the Attic and all that stuff, do a brilliant job. But there's going to come a point where you're like, why would we bother?
For sure.
Because the music's not a huge part of the experience of watching those shows. We could just go, make me something which is a bit like that, and just slot it in.
So I guess all the library people, the people who write for the library.
Well,
library
why would you
music.
bother paying for it if you
Absolutely.
can get it? You know, it's like, why would people buy a record when you can stream it for nothing, listen to it whenever you want, wherever you want? Why would you bother buying it?
Absolutely.
It's, you know, the world is changing rapidly, and I do feel sorry for young people who are emerging at the moment, you know, into an environment where traditionally you could have made a good living, and now it looks like it's moving more towards, if you can afford to do it, then you can do it, and if you can't afford to do it, then you can't. You know, if someone's sponsoring you, or you've got another job, you know, it's getting a bit like that. Anyway, let's not dwell on that.
So you'll, you know, jump in a year or so. I suppose the Independence Day was the first big job you had, wasn't it?
Well, I say Stargate, well, I mean, they all
Stargate.
feel big to me, you know. It's like doing these little things at 33 for Danny felt big at the time, because it was like, that's all I had, you know. So if it's all you have, then you put everything into it, and then the next thing happens, it's like, well, this is the thing. And then Danny did his graduation film, which, you know, there was some money for that for real players, so I was able to go into Angel Studios with real string players and conduct for the first time properly, and have, you know, string section, and be able to write knowing that sound I could achieve it. And from that point on, then Young Americans happened, and then we did the song with Björk. The song with Björk had a big hit, so all of a sudden people were answering the phone. If I said, do you want to do this? They would go, oh, it's that guy who did that, rather than, don't know who you are, go away. That changed all that. And then one of the pieces from Young Americans found its way to Roland Emmerich, who was doing Stargate at the time. And I've still got no idea really why they asked me, because I literally had the experience of doing one feature film, low budget British feature, and all of a sudden I'm doing this sort of $50 million, quite a big deal, American Hollywood sort of sci-fi film. But they asked me to do it. They flew me over. And I didn't really know what to expect, and I didn't really know what to do even, because everything had been done in a bedroom. Young Americans was written in my bedroom. You know, I was sharing a flat with Danny, and I was sitting on the edge of my bed with the keyboard set up at the end and a VHS machine and a couple of synths, and that was it. That's how I wrote it. And then all of a sudden you're, you know, like Hollywood where everyone's got a studio. And I only knew how to do it the way I'd done it. So that is actually how I did, certainly Stargate and Independence Day was done exactly the same way, with that same equipment, you know, a few more bits and pieces, but generally the same stuff. Which again brings me back to that, you know, the equipment is secondary to the idea, you know, and if you can get it on paper, then, you know, I knew ultimately this was going to be performed by real people, so it didn't have to sound amazing, just so, you know, we knew what it would, ultimately what it was going to be like. But Roland heard a particular piece of music from Young Americans and liked it because, again, going back to the conversation we were having about Danny wanted it to be cinematic and I wanted the music to feel like, you know, big cinematic music, more like Morricone and John Barry than Kraftwerk. So he heard that in this music and said, "We'll give him a go," and they offered it to me. And then 6 months later, I was living in this Hollywood hotel writing Stargate for a few months.
Wow.
Then that came out, did really well, somewhat unexpectedly for everyone, I think. And then Roland's next film was Independence Day.
Right. Yeah,
exactly the same process, sitting in a hotel room with this gear that I've been working on since doing student films. So it took a while before that changed, but you know, it makes you realise that it's the ideas that are the great currency, you know, not the technology.
And this is coming out of personal interest, but presumably some of that was recorded in Hollywood with one of those big orchestras,
yes.
studio orchestras.
Yeah. We were in the big rooms. I think Independence Day was recorded in 5 separate studios, but it was all the big ones, like the Sony studio, which is the biggest room, which is where they did all the old MGM musicals. And Paramount had their own studio called Stage M, where we did some of the strings. And there were several other places. A lot of them are shut down now, but there were 5. I know we did record it at 5 different places. And that's a different world as well, like American musicians and American Musicians Union rules and, you know, all that stuff. It's all very different.
And did you have to conduct any of that, or did?
I didn't. No, I'm terrified of conducting. So no, so Nick came over and conducted. And interestingly, like all the people that I worked with were people that I met before anything had ever happened.
Well, that's interesting.
You know, like
so they all grew up in there.
Yeah, people at 33, and then I was working at a place called Thatch Cottage Audio, which was a place that sold equipment but also had a little studio, and we recorded there as a band a couple of times. And Dave Simpson, the guy who owned it, I said, "Can I do my student films in your studio?" And he goes, "Yeah, if you work for me like 2 or 3 days a week." So I did, and I met loads of people there. Nick I met when he was coming in, and I was demonstrating a sampler to him, Yamaha's first sampler called a TX16W, and it had a brilliant French horn sample on it. And he came in, and I demoed it by playing John Williams' Superman thing, and it was like sold, bought it, started talking about music. Been working with him ever since. You know, it was like 4 years ago.
Yeah, you still work.
Yeah, amazing. And then Rob Playford, who I met he came to a recording course down there. He went on to be the sort of engineer and the programmer for Goldie, and basically became drum and bass, and then was my sort of programmer for about 3 or 4 years as well. I did films with him. So a lot of the people that I worked with forever, I met in these places before anyone was anything.
That's really interesting. And presumably you're at a point now where you don't have to hustle, do you? People come to you.
No, that happened really quickly. I mean, it went from nothing to everything in about in the space of 6 months. Wow. Really. I said I was sharing a flat with Danny in London when we did Young Americans, and then we rented another little muse house in Camden when he was doing Judge Dredd and I was doing Stargate. So I'd come home, we'd talk about Stargate recordings, and you know, he'd come home with the Diane Lane and stuff like that, and you know, just weird. He'd have all the props and things in this, you know, quite a small flat with 2 blokes sharing it, doing these things. But it was funny, and it's, you know, it was still kind of living like that in a way. You know, not the way you necessarily might expect. But from that point on, once Stargate had happened and became a hit, you realise the power economic success in North America. If you do a movie which does a lot of business, all of a sudden everyone's going like, hold on, he's been a part of something that's been successful, therefore we can assume that part of the success might be down to what they've done. And so you're the new kid on the block, you know, you've had this movie which has been well received, music was very well received, luckily, it was very old fashioned, I think. Yeah, then you start getting asked to do things.
Yeah, so it's sprinkling stardust.
Yeah,
Sort of.
so within like 2 years, it was sort of Young Americans, Stargate, a film called Lost the Dogman, and then Independence Day. And Independence Day went global, and then Bond happened after that, like a year after that. So
and that was again an approach to you because of...
Yeah, well, you know, things happened, one thing happened after another. But I was always doing what I wanted to do, which was lucky. Again, you know, it goes back to that thing, it's like, you go to 33 and everyone was doing what they wanted to do, what they wanted, what they thought was right for them at the time.
Yeah, so that ethos just carried on through your life.
Yeah.
Are you allowed to say, I mean, economically, in terms of making a living, are you allowed to say on record about what happened about being paid for Stargate? Wasn't there some kind of problem on that?
No, it wasn't that much, but I mean, what I was offered to work on Stargate was like the equivalent of what I'd earned for the past 5 years.
Yeah.
But what I'd earned for the past 5 years was like $7,000 a year, because I was like, I was eking it out. You know, I knew that I could survive on very little, and I thought if I want to do music, I don't want to have to be not doing music in order to do a day job, which meant that I couldn't do music.
Yeah.
So I would sort of do 2 or 3 weeks temping, you know, where I would this is when I was doing student films and films with Danny, where I do 2 or 3 weeks on a building site or in a shop, or, you know, stewarding at something, or over at Leighton Buzzard unloading sacks of potatoes at 4 o'clock in the morning for supermarkets. I'd do that for a couple of weeks, and that was enough to get me through the next 2 or 3 weeks, which was when I'd be writing student film. And so to be offered any quarter money, which meant like, well, this is more than I've ever seen. Yeah, that was the first time when something significant had happened financially. But I was always very careful not to overextend myself to the point where I would have to do things I didn't want to do. So I still, you know, I didn't have a flat, I didn't own a property, don't think maybe second-hand car, you know, still very worried about whether I could, you know, could I live the rest of my life on this bit that I've earned now and not have to do anything else?
Yeah.
And I still think about that.
Yeah.
I'm still turning the lights off. Still worrying about making a phone call before 6 o'clock.
Yeah.
You talk about stay with Alan Parker, because that must have opened the door.
Well, it opened the Alan Parker situation was Alan Parker was as an eye opener. I mean, it was extraordinary. Alan was a judge on the BBC Young Filmmaker of the Year competition, and he took a shine to Danny because Danny had used some temp music which he'd taken from an Alan Parker film, and I think Alan recognised a certain continuity of ideas with his. You know, he liked sort of commercial movies and music, and Danny liked the same thing. So I think he saw something of himself. Danny was supportive of him, and he happened to mention to me, if you're ever in Hollywood, you know, come and look me up. I don't think he meant it, but I thought, I'm going to go. So this was pre-Young Americans.
Yeah.
I thought, I'm going to go, I'm going to save up, I'm going to get a play. I was working at Milton Keynes at the time. I said, I'm going to fly over and I'm going to call him up and say, hey, remember you said, anyway. So I did, and God bless him, he put me up in his house. And his son was a couple of years younger than me, Alex, who was working, he got him a job working on a Bill Cosby film called Leonard Part 6 in the editorial department, doing sound editing. And he said, you can go in with Alex if you want. So again, from Luton, then we end up in Hollywood, and then I find myself walking through the gates of Paramount and seeing an entire town full of people doing what I wanted to do. They were all working in film, and it wasn't a big deal that they were working. It was their job. It's what they did, and it felt like the kind of the kind of curtain fell down a little bit, or it parted certainly. You're like, oh, this is achievable.
Yeah.
These are people who have got, they are working in this industry that I want to work in. And I came back from that trip. I was there for 2 weeks, and I immediately quit my job and thought, if I'm not going to do it now, I'm never going to do it. That's when I started doing all the temp work and everything.
Right.
Yeah, I became quite philosophical about it, but it was an easy decision to make, because I thought, like, I've kind of denied myself any of the sort of responsibilities. Like, I didn't have a flat, I still lived with mum and dad at the time. I didn't have a car, or I didn't go anywhere, I didn't do anything. So I could live quite frugally, and that's how I managed to do it. And Alan, in a way, just by allowing me to be there, sort of showed me that it's a possibility. And it's difficult to think about it in concrete terms when you're from somewhere like this, because it all feels so alien. It doesn't feel like there's not a route to this kind of work. And it was a series of kind of odd connective things that happened. But if you boil it down, sometimes I do talks to universities about, people say, like, what was your lucky break? What was your break? And some people would say that, oh, my break was, if you're a model, I was walking down the street and someone saw me and said, you should do this. Or I was playing, some guy from EMI happened to be at a gig I was at, and they said, do you want a record contract? I realised that actually my break was meeting Danny at 33, because if I'd never have done that, I'd have never have done the other things. And it was only the fact that he made The Young Americans and I did that led to the rest of the stuff happening. So I think, your big break might have already happened to you. I'm just always constantly telling people to be aware of who they're around and what they're doing.
And the kind of life's accidents. Those bumping into people.
Yeah,
So,
you never know. It's being aware of everything constantly, of what's going on and who's where and what does this mean and what could it mean and what can I take from it, what can I make from it.
Do you still keep in touch with Danny at all?
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, he's lived in America ever since, really.
Yes.
And he's like one of the biggest names in American TV. Is he doing this? Are you talking to him? Or?
He sent us a few words. Danny.
It's great to put together.
What were his few words? F off.
Something like that. He's not been very communicative, but has he ever asked you to do any more music? For any of the TV projects?
I think he asked about one thing once, but I didn't fancy it. I got to the point when I realised that if I didn't really want to do the project, then I shouldn't do it.
No.
Even if it's him. Do you know what I mean? And it's like, and I think our tastes kind of diverged a little after Young Americans, and he likes what he likes and I what I liked, and there was a point where it's like we did like the same thing, but I don't think we necessarily do anymore creatively. You know what I mean? But I still see him. If he comes over, I mean, I never go over there, and he doesn't come over here all so much. But it's more like Facebook, just keeping in touch. But so.
But you're right, because we had different tastes. I remember taking you to go and see Ran by Kurosawa.
Yeah.
And you coming out of it and think, oh God, and you saying that was really boring.
Yeah.
Why did you take me to that?
Yeah.
And I thought it was amazing.
Yeah.
But you do obviously there's
well, also
room
you
for
took me
everyone,
to see
isn't
Thundercrack
there?
at the Scala,
Oh yeah.
which I thought was
Did I?
brilliant.
Oh, my
Yeah, that was
Did
brilliant.
I take you to see?
Oh, yeah,
oh
yeah,
my
yeah,
God,
yeah.
I mean that's quite extreme.
Yeah, I'd never seen anything like that before. I thought, this is good. Someone actually made that film. It's like someone thought this is a good idea. Let's make a film about that. I talk about that quite a lot. It's such a crazy, strange film. But there was something else we saw. Oh, we saw one of the Chaucers with.
Pasolini.
Yeah, Pasolini.
Yeah.
With Tom.
Canterbury Tales.
Yeah.
Probably, yeah.
Yeah.
It's a struggle for me.
So Spike used to take me to see the arty things.
Yeah. Talking about arty things, one of the things I always loved when you did the thing with the Shirley Bassey, that was
Yes.
crazy.
I wouldn't say that was an arty thing.
No, but
It was interesting. It was very interesting. It's like all of these things, you know. It's like at the end of the process, you think if I'd have known that at the beginning, this could have all been so much easier in a way.
Yeah.
But you know, once you know someone and you know how they do things, everything gets a little bit simpler.
Yeah.
But no, she's
Lovely lady,
has always been
Yeah.
extraordinary as a performer. She's extraordinary, and it's all worth it
Yeah.
for that moment. But it's you know, it's quite a complicated experience.
Okay.
And it all comes down to, like with most things, you know, you've got to feel comfortable, and yeah, it's quite an exposed thing when you're singing. You have to create an atmosphere within which they feel sort of safe and secure. And even after all these years of being so brilliant, she still needs that space to work for her, you know. And it's the same when she's doing live stuff. Everything needs to be right for her to become
Who she is,
Yeah.
in a way. Yeah.
So that's why working with her subsequently has been easier.
Yeah. Yeah.
But no, she's incredible.
The one of the kind of things about this project is, like youth clubs at the moment, the kind of possibilities of places like 33 existing are much more difficult now, purely by the way that funding works.
Yeah.
The funding now comes top down and
Yeah.
funds the organisations and the staffing and all that stuff. Whereas back in the day, you know, 33 days, any money that came into place came from the bottom up, you know, and went for facilities, creating
Yeah.
opportunities for people.
Yeah.
And you know, in society at the moment, because there's no youth clubs, there are no possibilities for those kind of grassroots arts development.
Yeah.
I just wondered if you had a view on all of that. And
Well, it's only by sort of doing work with, you know, I've done talks at LIPA, you know, the Paul McCartney's place in Liverpool, and at the Brit School, which is a, you know, audition based, not financial, it's free for people who want to go. Incredible amount of talent still around, with nowhere to go, you know, and now we're losing sort of grassroots venues as well. I mean, music education in school, it just does so much more than just teach about music, you know, as we sort of discussed briefly earlier in terms of the value of it societally. And you realise how many sort of young people have a voice through music, can find a voice through music, find themselves through it. And when you're talking about having an audience, that immediately means you have to emphasise people and be able to be articulate in what you think and how you see yourself and the message that you are delivering. You know, it involves a lot of thinking about important things, and if you don't have the facility to do that, either encourage it either through music or after school activities or youth clubs or music centres or anything. I mean, the Roundhouse in Camden has an amazing facility in its basement, which is sort of studios and rehearsal spaces for young people to come and play. And you think, like, well, we need 100 of them.
yes,
We need them everywhere, because
every
you know, and then you find that, you know, that in terms of the sort of music industry and the arts industry, if it's going to be you know, like purely the domain of sort of upper middle class people who can afford to do it because they don't have to work, you know, because they've got money backing them up, then, you know, then we've had it. You know, it's like there will be no legacy artists. You know, you think like most of the record companies making bulk of their money from legacy artists on reissues and remixes and, you know, selling the same thing back to them. And you've got like the big festivals that, you know, need the headliners, and they're increasingly year on year getting older and older and older. You think, well, who are, you know, where is the next British music industry? You know, where's that coming from? Because if you're not playing, if you're not supporting people learning, if you're not providing them the platform by which they can go out and play in front of people, because there's still an audience. You know, people go to these festivals, and there's still people who want to hear music and see live music, and we know that the consumption of music is out of control. You know, it's like there's so much demand for it, and yet there's so little put into people who create it. So it's a bit of a disaster, I think. You know, it's shooting itself in the foot so obviously. You know, it seems so obvious that it would be better if we had places for people to go to do these things. And seeing it in some of these places, like the Brit School and with Lipper and with, you know, the Roundhouse and just the London-based ones and Liverpool, that, you know, people still want to go. You know, they want to be in places like that. And there's so many people, like professionals, who will give their time to be a part of that, to talk them through it. You know, I mean, I do talks around the country at universities and colleges, talking about the reality of the industry. And now it's like, it's getting embarrassing because everyone's going, what do I do? I go, like, I don't know now. Because it used to be you could do all these things.
Yeah, you could signpost people to.
But now you
things.
can't sell a record.
Yeah.
You know, it's like, you know, now you can't play anywhere because there's nowhere to play. You know, where do you go? Everyone's training to do a thing where it might not even exist in 3 or 4 years. So
and you
yeah.
have that cycle thing, don't you, where people go to the academies and they come out and it can't work, so they teach, and then it creates another level of people who don't have a job.
Yeah. It's a false economy to cut down on music in schools, and it's a false economy to lose social services and youth services and opportunities for that. So anywhere where that happens, generally positive things follow, and I can't see the reasoning for that not happening.
No. Well, I think that wraps it up, Dave. Really.
Hooray!